Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give you an overview of our Quantitative DR QA protocol and our experience of introducing the new techniques with minimal resources. And I should mention my colleague David Caldwell, who was the key driver behind this protocol. So this is the Misericordiae University Hospital. It was set up by the Sisters of Mercy over 150 years ago. This is where I started my training, and our radiology department was up until 10 years ago, located in the very corner there, in the very old part of the hospital. And now we have this new part of the hospital. Don't worry, we didn't knock down the old building. We still have it, but on the other side of the road, we have our new radiology department, where we have our new department, and this is what started our process. So our new radiology department was built and opened in 2013. Previously in the old department, we were dealing mostly with CR technology. We had a few digital detectors, maybe 3 in total. But with the move to the new hospital and the new department, we went to completely DR technology. All CR technology was removed. The commissioning process took about a year in total, probably. We commissioned our tests using the KCAR protocols. Some of you may be familiar with them. They were based on UK a group. And the commissioning tests, as I said, were used with the KCAR protocols. These protocols were set up to around 2005, 2006. So already when we started using them, they were what we would consider out of date. So in our commissioning process, we wanted to compare our results with the manufacturer specifications. So the manufacturer specifications for the DR detectors included things like measurements of MTF and DQE. But when we looked at our commissioning results and compared them with the manufacturer specifications, we weren't measuring MTF or DQE. We were measuring spatial resolution, line pairs, contrast, but we weren't getting into the what we call in Ireland the nitty-gritty of the digital detector. So we began the process to look at how we could look at our quantitative DR QA protocols and how we could start to measure these type of measurements, which were being published by the manufacturer. So we started looking at our literature review, seeing what other people were doing. We looked at the IEC standards. There are standards there for establishing these measurements by the IEC. And we looked at what the manufacturers were doing, and it took us a period of about a year, 18 months before we actually started doing our quantitative DR QA. There was a process of validating the software and a lot of trial and error. So what are the requirements for a DR quality assurance program? Well, it must be quick and achievable. So our medical physics resources are under increasing demands. We didn't really gain too many extra staff members when we moved from the old hospital to the new hospital, but we gained a lot of new technology. We gained, new CT scanners, a lot of DR digital detectors with our mobile machines, and we were dealing with a much larger demand for these systems, and we weren't allowed access to the rooms. I'm sure it's something that everybody suffers from, getting the time to get your QA done. We wanted to make our QA quantitative without the use of any subjective measurements. We had a number of staff members. We wanted to be able to be consistent, to be able to trend our data, so we didn't want to use subjective measurements where somebody was looking at a screen and counting dots or looking at line pairs. We also wanted to make the QA clinically relevant and to be able to measure things like the detector dose indicator, accuracy, uniformity, noise, low contrast resolution, and things like spatial resolution, as well as measuring things like the DQE, the NEQ, and the noise power spectrum, those kind of issues. And also we have to look at things like ghosting and dark noise. So there are a number of guidance documents out there. In Ireland, we tend to look across the water to the UK first, where we look at the IPM, and they have a lot of good guidelines out there. We also have now the RP 162 from the European Commission, and as I mentioned earlier, we looked at the KCAR protocols, and of course to the other side of the ocean to AAPM as well. But you have to make sure that whatever process you set up for your quality assurance, that you're meeting the local regulatory compliance as well. There are different rules in different countries. We looked at the literature, so there's a number of papers out there on these type of techniques. Some of the famous people like Ishan Samai and Nick Marshall, they were the leaders in setting up these type of measurements. So we looked at all the different methods, and we decided on our method. And our method involves obtaining just 7 images to get the results that we needed. So very quick. But the longest part of the process is probably the beam preparation process. So this is the first step where you want to establish your signal transfer property curve for your detector. So you need to set up your beam to ensure that you're getting the right radiation quality. So we were looking at RQA5, and this was chosen based on the IEC standards. We use a focus to detector distance of 180 centimeters to avoid any effects of the heel effect, and we are using a filtration of 0.5 mil of copper and 3 mils of aluminium. The IEC standards recommend using 21 mils of aluminium, but when we looked at some of the recommendations, so the AAPM recommended using this combination. When you look at the spectrum, using a spectrum analyzer, you can match the spectrum of using 21 mils of aluminium without having to use the very thick aluminium, which can be an issue. Anybody who's done any sort of QA will realize how hard it is to tape 21 mils of aluminium onto an X-ray tube. So we went with this process as recommended in TG 166. And we set up the beam using typically around 70 kV, and we adjusted to make sure we're getting the right half value there. And I mentioned that we used a spectrum analyzer at the start to make sure we had the right spectrum. And we adjusted the doses, so we use, typically is recommended to use between 2.5 and 10 microgray, and we measured this with a calibrated dosimeter. So as I said, we obtained just 7 images to get all the results that we need. The grid should be removed before you take your images, and you should always be using 4 processing images. And that sounds easy, but anybody who has done QA will know, especially when you're dealing with digital detectors, it can be very hard to get raw flat field images from a system. So you need to have a very good relationship with your engineers, with your service companies. Each company has a different method of giving you access to raw images, so it's important that you make contact with them at the very start when you're setting up your protocol. And be careful as well when you're using PACS system to get your images, because sometimes PACS can add a little bit of processing to your raw images. So we have the 7 images. 4 or 5 of them are just uniform flat field images, and then we have one which is which we use for our tantalum target, which is for our MTF measurement, and one dark noise image. So we started off using Matlab. Anybody who used Matlab may be familiar with this. One of our programmers in our department set up a GUI for this. But the problem with Matlab is it's quite expensive, and every time you want to add in something new, you have to have the correct toolkits, and it can be an issue. We also had an issue with licensing, and our hospital, since we had a cyber attack last year in Ireland, we have a lot of problems with using certain software in our hospitals. So we moved from Matlab to Python. And if you see here, I don't know if you can see my colleague here, Dave, it's difficult to see, but while I'm talking, he's actually typing in all the data that you need. So we type in the doses that have been used, the file directory where the images are, and then the Excel spreadsheet. So there's just 3 inputs that need to be added into the Python system. It's fully automated, it's much quicker, and there's no need for any expensive toolkits. And it's also much more customizable compared with commercial software. We were very careful, I'm thinking about the previous speaker, of making sure that our software is validated and comparing with other commercially available software. And in Ireland, we have a group where we work together and compare different QA protocols and software, so we were able to send our images to another hospital to analyse to make sure that our results were consistent with what they were achieving. So you'll see there all the graphs that are outputted from the software. So these are the main results so that we include in our protocol. So we have detector dose reproducibility, we have our STB curve, we look at the uniformity, we use two different methods. We use the IPM 91 method, which is where you look at the 5 regions of interest, and then we also use the checkerboard method, which some of you may be familiar with from mammogram or from mammography, where you analyze images. We look at things like the variance of the image, and as I said, the MTF, things like the noise power spectrum, DQE, and then we look at dark noise and our image retention. So there's a lot of data that is output, comes from our software, but a lot of we don't present it all to the radiologists and the radiographers. If we did, they would be very confused, I think. So we just produce a summary of our results. The problem with DRQA is, and with digital detectors, is published tolerances for modern quantitative metrics are sparse. There's nothing really included in a lot of the recommendations, even in RP 162. So what we do is we tend to trend our quantitative metrics and compare them to and comment on any irregularities. And this is just an example of a summary that we would produce to one of our radiologists or our radiographers, detailing all the measurements, and we tell whether if they passed or failed. And then in the background, we're constantly trending our data to see how our detectors are operating. We have mostly GE detectors with some Siemens and Philips in our hospital. So how do we present these results to non-physics staff? So we have the summary charts, and then we have some written data, and we just highlight, I've just highlighted in red here the important parts for the radiologist. So we mentioned things like uniformity, we mentioned the measure of the spatial resolution, explain to them what it means in simple terms. And it's probably a little bit difficult for you to see there, but this is what we include in our reports. So I mentioned minimal resources. So our minimal resources, so the costs involved in setting up this protocol, we had the cost of the copper and aluminium, so you have to make sure you have the really pure 99.9%, approximately 1,000 euros in Ireland. Our target for our MTF, 400 euros. You need a calibrated dose meter, which is usually available. Access to Matlab, which has a high cost, or Python if it's free. And you also need some very good programmers. And I'm lucky that I have a number in my department, and this is Ronan and David enjoying a beer at ECMP in Dublin. So that's it. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them, or you can email me, and I can discuss it with you then.